Today's question, though. Today, we're going to spend most of our time talking about one specific question, and it's a big one, and it's a great question that came in actually in the box from one of the handwritten questions that came that I was not thinking about addressing in this until I saw it, and then I realized how frequently I've been asked something like this in my life, and how frequently I've even asked it myself. And if you can't ask difficult questions at church, well, you're going to ask them anyways, right? You're going to ask them everywhere else, and so we just kind of want to respond, even if we don't know all of the answers. But here's the question that was asked initially, is this: can faith and science coexist? That's not the exact verbiage of it, but that's kind of what we're going to try to address today. Can faith and science coexist? And before I really respond to anything on that, and I don't want to sound nitpicky at all, this is actually an important part of answering this question. An important part of responding to this question is acknowledging, first of all, the first answer to that question, can faith and science coexist, is that depends on the faith, right? Because some faiths cannot coexist with science. There are some faiths that would, in order to be a part of that faith, and I'm not speaking down on that, I'm just saying, in order to be a part of some faiths, you have to abandon reason and logic and let's be honest, truth, reality. Like, you have to abandon scientific research and anything that would point to things that are potentially contrary to that faith. You have to just leave those things behind. I'm not going to speak on behalf of any faiths like that today. So the first blank on your sermon notes, just so we can kind of clarify the question that I am actually going to respond to today, is this: can biblical faith and science coexist? Can the faith that is presented in these scriptures, can the story of God's love for people and of the person of Jesus Christ, which is what we here at Risen actually believe the Bible is all about. We believe it all points to Jesus. It all revolves around him. The point of everything was to get to Jesus so that he might be our salvation. And so that's the question we're kind of addressing. Does that sound interesting to you? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. I don't know. It kind of depends. Maybe that depends a little bit on the generation you're from. My generation, this has been a major question for us. I was raised in southern West Virginia and was born in the 80s. Ayo! And through the 90s in southern West Virginia, there was a bit of a war between religion and science. Like, this was when textbooks were starting to contain some evolution theory and some of the stories of the origin of man, and even talks about dinosaurs and a lot of that. And there was a fight between the church and these scientific books and the state, essentially. There was a fight that emerged. Maybe you're familiar with the fight. Maybe there was something like that here or wherever you're from. There kind of has been for a really long time, that essentially says, you can't teach our kids anything that runs contrary to these scriptures. And so today we're actually going to sort of look at the idea that, I don't know if necessarily we were being taught something that was contrary to our scriptures. I think to some extent we may have misunderstood what the Bible even is. If we respond to this question, can biblical faith and science coexist? If we would say to that, no, they can't, I would say, I think maybe you've misunderstood what the Bible actually is. And so does that sound like a question that we want to get into? You already said yes. Even if you didn't, I was going to go with this one. This is the notes that are in front of me. So this is the message I was going to go with either way. Just so you know, we're not totally choose your own adventure here. But many Christians, many followers of Christ have felt a responsibility to sort of resist the lies and attacks of the scientific community. And today I want to spend some talking about why there seems to be such a dispute, why this question may have been raised, and why maybe you've been asking it in your own mind. And I'm going to break this down into two ideas that really build on each other. The first one I'm going to give you real quickly, and then we'll get into the second one, which I'm going to spend some time on. And that's what's in the sermon notes. If you like to write along with us, take some notes on that. We actually made the sermon notes. Originally, they were designed to be very close to the dimensions of your iPhone, so that at the end of the service, if you fill in your notes and everything, and you think, I'm probably going to lose this piece of paper, you just take a little picture of it, and it actually fits it. You try it, all right? Try it, and then call my wife a genius. So you always have your phone, right? You might lose paper, but you don't lose your phone, not for long. Take those notes with you. Two ideas, two rules, really. that I think are necessary. If faith and science are going to coexist, if biblical faith and science are going to coexist, we're going to have to sort of understand these rules. First is this: don't allow pride to cloud truth. I would say biblical faith and science can coexist if we follow these two rules, if we get these two ideas under control. And the first one is this: we don't let pride get in the way of truth, because it can do that. See, too often we're more concerned with being right than we are with the truth. We want to be proved that we're right more than we want the truth, and that kind of clouds things, and it works in both directions. This could happen potentially in the scientific community. You're probably familiar with experiments that basically people were pretty sure the results they were going to get, and can actually force those results, as that you can actually sort of mess up the experiment as you go along. And we kind of do this sometimes with it. So let's not let our pride get in the way of actual truth. Proverbs tells us. So the same scriptures that we think we're defending, sometimes pridefully, sometimes violently, sometimes just very vehemently, those scriptures also tell us in Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction. Haughtiness before a fall. Anybody feeling haughty today? This is an encouragement to not get ourselves in over our heads, right? We only know what we know, and that's okay. And we don't know what we don't know, and that's okay. We're a community of people who are very comfortable, or at least trying to become more increasingly comfortable with saying, I don't actually know the answer to the question that you're asking me right now. It's extremely, extremely important to your role in moving the gospel forward and introducing people to Jesus, for you to understand when to say, I don't know. I don't know. I can't really explain that. I don't have an answer for that. The truth, I would say it this way. This is a statement I think that's going on the screen. The truth can handle itself, or it's not the truth. Makes sense? Humility is an incredible weapon in our discussions, if you want to think of it that way. Humility is what is necessary here. If the truth is the truth, then it doesn't need your help. That's all I'm kind of saying. I'm not saying we don't stand for truth. I'm not saying we don't stand for what's right. I'm just saying that when we don't know, it's okay to say, I don't know, but I'm guessing the truth can handle itself. God and the Bible were here a long time before we got here, and they've been doing just fine, right? God's been doing just fine without us arguing for him. Linus Pauling, maybe someone you may be familiar with, he won the Nobel Prize as a scientist 2 times. Extremely brilliant scientist. He actually defines science like this. He says science is the search for truth. And as long as that is the case, then we, the church, we, the community of faith, really have nothing to fear. Like, if we believe that God is the ultimate truth, well, then scientists are working for God, whether they believe it or not, right? If what they're doing is searching for truth, then we really have nothing to fear. Let's think of it this way. One more statement to throw up there to kind of help us process through this, and then I'll get into the second idea. You never have to fear the work of a true scientist if you believe God is the ultimate truth, right? If our faith can be disproved or upended by the discovery of something in the material world, well, then what are we doing here, right? If our faith is that delicate that it's like, no, don't lift that rock. I don't want to know what's under that rock. If you lift that rock up, you will destroy my God. Well, then, it makes sense. The truth can handle itself. We don't have to fear the work of true scientists. The scientist whose definition of science is the search for truth. Well, we could say, well, if you go searching for truth, I think you might find God. That's how I would suggest that we feel about it. If you're a Christian and you're a believer in here, and you're kind of wondering what's my role to play as far as the pride element of this is concerned, I would say humble yourself to that point where we just sort of let truth speak for itself. Let God handle this. He can handle it. James 4:7. This is a New Testament response to a sort of New Testament handlebars for the command or the warnings of Proverbs 16. It says pride leads to destruction. Well, what do we do? What do we do instead? James says, humble yourselves before God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. What's the devil here? Well, the devil is pride. Original sin is all tied up in this idea that I have to know everything, right? Adam and Eve were tempted to eat of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. I want to know everything. I want to know all of it. I need to know, no. That's this pride of like, I have to be right. Resist the devil and he'll flee from you. Humble yourselves. And then it says, come close to God, and God will come close to you. Move in the direction of truth. And you might just be moving in the direction of God. Trust the truth. Let it stand for itself. So let's not let pride cloud truth. Now, are you interested in the second idea? Have I got your attention? I think we got to start with that. We got to start with this sort of elimination of pride. We got to like, okay, I don't know everything. I just don't. I don't understand everything. I don't understand God's ways. I don't know how he did a lot of stuff. I don't really even know everything the Bible says about all this stuff. I don't have all of those answers. So if we can eliminate the pride element of this, then I think we can move into this second idea, and it's really kind of written as a rule. And this is it. Don't confuse how with why. Don't confuse how with why. For me, and you don't have to believe everything I believe to be a part here. I'm glad we all kind of disagree a little bit on certain things. And so you don't have to believe it the way I believe it, see it the way I see it. For me, the Bible is not a very scientific book. It's not written to be scientific. It's not designed to be a book that explains how God made everything. It just doesn't do that. It really doesn't. Even the places in Scripture that that lay out the origins of man, they're done in a poem, right? You're familiar with the poem of Genesis chapter 1. That's where we're told that's not very scientific. That actually makes it very difficult to like, but mathematically, God, I need the mathematics scientific explanation. Well, it doesn't do that. And I'm sorry that it doesn't do that. I don't know where that voice came from. I'm real sorry for whatever. There's someone else. There are others who live in here, apparently. And every once in a while, they come to the surface. Now, I'm not suggesting, and we're going to get into this in just a second, I'm not suggesting that the Bible doesn't offer scientifically verifiable explanations for things. I'm just saying that whenever it comes to the origins of the world and the origins of people, well, that stuff's written in poetry. That stuff is written with imagery and metaphors and artistry. Now, if it sounds like I'm saying that you should ignore the details because they're wrong, you'd be missing my point altogether. What I'm going to show you today is really, especially in the origins of man, and I'm not going to address everything, I'm just going to give you one example of this how and why thing, the difference between how and why. I want to show you one place where this I only want to remind you that the Bible is a historically accurate, often artistic and poetic explanation of who God is and why you're here. That's what the Scriptures are. They are the story of who God is and why you're here. They do not explain how at every turn. Most of us would not try to argue that there's no such thing as an atom. A-T-O-M. not A-D-A-M, not the first man. An A-T-O-M, atom. That's not mentioned in here at all, right? Most of us would not try to argue that there's no such thing as Jupiter. You can see it. It's not mentioned in here at all, right? This is not really a how science book. That's not to say that those things don't exist. It's just to say this book is about who God is and why you're here. But that poem that tells us about how God made everything is remarkable. This artistic story, and we're going to read it in just a second. So in Genesis 1, I'm going to read that to you. But before I do that, I got to give you a little bit of history of why we're going to read that. In the early 1800s, there was a man named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Anybody familiar with Jean-Baptiste, the work of Jean-Baptiste? Yeah. He proposed his theory of transmutation of species. And then in around 1858, someone else came along, who I'm guessing you probably know who that is, building on some of the foundations of Jean-Baptiste and the other people who came even before him, a man named Charles Darwin, along with Alfred Russel Wallace, improved on the transmutation of species concept, and then Charles Darwin in 1859 published a book called On the Origin of Species. And in this book, he outlined some incredible some brilliant, some remarkable ideas about the origin of species, about the evolution of people, and how single-cell organisms became vertebrate organisms that then evolved over time into... Now, there's a lot of that book that is incredible, really brilliant. There's a lot of it that is now considered in the scientific community to be fact. Like, it's just, it gave the scientific community a place to, a foundation to stand on, to move forward in the fields of archaeology and biology and anatomy and chemistry. Like, they were incredible. And I think, just as a side note here, I'm just going to pause for just, this isn't in the notes, but I think we, as the community of Christ, the followers of Jesus, the church, we do a great disservice to the gospel by calling extremely brilliant people stupid, because they don't exactly teach things that we like or would prefer. I think that's a big mistake. And I've heard that a lot in my life, like Charles Darwin's some kind of idiot. Well, that's not true. It's just not, and that's okay. You don't have to agree with everything that he said, but we don't... This part of the reason that we live in the world that we live in today, scientifically, some of the things that we benefit from are because of the works, the foundational works here. And I think, this is particularly interesting that this week, Stephen Hawking actually passed away on March 14th, a brilliant thinker, very well known. I can't remember if he was truly an atheist or an agnostic, but definitely had some bitter feelings towards the church and religion, and did not believe that organized religion was such a great thing, but one of the most brilliant thinkers and scientists that the world has ever known, really. And we do a great disservice whenever we point at people like that and say, idiot. It's just not true. And you don't have to be afraid of people who have access to the truth that we don't have. Like they know some things that I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I study the Bible. I've tried to teach the Bible. Like that's... And so the way that I'm addressing all of this today is not really meant to give you a scientific explanation of anything. It's really just to respond to the question, can biblical faith and science be reconciled? Can those things coexist? And that's what I'm more interested in anything. So anyways, I got off track. I shouldn't have left the notes, guys. One of the elements of this discussion that is widely accepted as scientific fact at this point, and it's probably something that you're familiar with, especially if you went to public school. I went to public school. If you went to a Christian private school or were homeschooled, maybe you didn't get this teaching. That was some of what the church community did, and I'm not here to speak on whether or not that was the right thing, but most of us have seen something like this. This picture that we're going to see up here. This is vertebrate evolution. Have you seen something like this? Beautiful drawings of the animals too. I can't quite get over how awesome that pigeon looks. It's remarkable, isn't it? It's like a photograph. But anyway, so this is the path of vertebrate evolution, sort of laid out and made a way for us to sort of understand this discussion that essentially teaches this. Now, I'm not a scientist. I don't claim to know everything there is to know about any of this stuff. I don't really know anything about any of it. But this is something that I was taught in school and something that is pretty widely accepted in the scientific community, and it's something that Charles Darwin kind of paved the way for us to see the world this way, and for us to think of vertebrate evolution in this way. And here's a layman's version of it, and if I have any scientists in the room and doctors, and I know that I do, I'm real sorry about this, okay? I'm real sorry. You can correct this later. I'm going to try not to say anything wrong, but I am going to say some stuff that sounds pretty dumb if you know it pretty well. But this essentially looks like this. Vertebrate evolution shows us that first, there were fish. And then, there was some sort of path that got us from fish to like amphibian, to sort of a reptilian species that also is very closely related to birds. Right? So the reptiles and birds are pretty closely related, as I understand it. I've seen Jurassic Park 2. You've seen Jurassic Park 2, where they sort of discover that the DNA of a bird is actually a lot closer to the DNA of a dinosaur than an alligator, which runs contrary to popular belief, but that's what Jurassic Park 2 said, so you know that part's true. So we had fish, and then some sort of path that gets us from fish to these scurrying amphibious and reptilian creatures onto birds. And then from birds, we move into something like mammals. And then from mammals, on up to me, right? That's essentially the path, and that's a very layman's version of it, a very, we'll just call it dumb version of it. But it essentially says this: first fish, then some kind of scurrying amphibious thing, to bird, to mammal, to human. And that dates back to essentially Darwin. Darwin started that conversation. That he sort of, maybe some people suspected something like this before Darwin, at least a couple of years before, on the Origin of Species was published. But that's usually how scientific things work, that somebody was thinking this, and then somebody brilliant like Charles Darwin comes along and says, I think I can actually, put that into something that people could understand and work from. And that was published in 1859. About 150 years ago, we started thinking this way. And it really hasn't been disproved. There's been no way of really disproving this idea that first there were fish, and then there was some sort of path that we don't know exactly how it happened. That's where the missing link thing comes in. If you've ever seen pictures of the missing link to get from fish to bird, but there's something that kind of happened at some point. Amphibious reptilian creatures grow feathers, and the missing link is sort of shows that happening. But somehow we get from fish to bird to mammal to human 150 years ago. Have I violated anything majorly? I've not explained it super scientifically, but I just want to say that is kind of the position of what I want. And I'm just doing all of this as a way of saying, here's how I think we should read the scriptures. Here's something that I think we should begin to see. If you're asking, can biblical faith and science be reconciled? Yeah, I think as long as we don't mistake how for why. The earliest manuscripts of the book of Genesis, so the first 5 books of the Bible, were found about 1,000 years before Jesus, which would be about 3,000 years before On the Origins of Species were written. So about 3,000 years ago from now, Genesis 1 was discovered. That's not to say that that's when it was written. It's just when we can say historically we can verify that we found something like the earliest verses of Scripture in the Bible. Now, before I read this, I want to make a couple of disclaimers. I want to read Genesis chapter 1 to you. Not the entire thing, but just to hit some of the highlights. You're probably pretty familiar with this, but I want you to see something remarkable that happens considering what we just talked about. First, I want you to understand that the biblical Hebrew language uses less than 10,000 words, which means that for every Hebrew word, there are at least 100 English translations. We have over 1 million words that we use in the English language today, and there were about 10,000 words in all of this. 10,000 words are used in all of the Old Testament. So there are some places where we kind of have to see, like, we're translating the best we can, but they're using words that get translated a lot of different ways. It's not to say that it's unverifiable or inaccurate or anything like that. It's actually a pretty good thing that God knew what he was doing, that he wrote it in Hebrew, because some of the things that get conveyed in here really do need to be seen. They need that breadth, they need that power packed into those words. Some of our words have so little, they're such narrow words that they wouldn't have worked as well. So that's one thing you need to understand, that we're reading a text that has 100th of the number of words, 1% of the number of words that we use. And then the second thing that you need to see is this is a poem. It's very clearly an artistic explanation, not a scientific one. This wasn't written as science. There's wordplay, there's metaphor, there are other creative devices. But what gets conveyed here through this poem and through this art is remarkable. It's incredible. You ready? You excited to hear it? Yeah. In the beginning. I don't know what it says after that. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Cool. The earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Now, that, first of all, just first and foremost, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Is that scientific enough for you? Does that explain how at every level? That doesn't explain how at all. It's not supposed to. This book isn't about how. It's about why. It's more about that than it is about how, right? It doesn't say how God did everything. It just says that God did everything. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. And then we move through, and we see this poem emerging. I'll read a couple of verses of it just to see the poem, and then I'm going to skip down to what I think is extremely interesting today, and just a tool for you to use as you're answering this question for yourself and responding to this question for yourself. This is how we're told. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness night, and evening passed, and morning came, marking the first day. Does that sound like science? No, it sounds like poetry. Again, it's a poem. It's a poetic, artistic rendition of what actually happened. Also, the Hebrew word for day, just for fun, just kicks and giggles. We're all about kicks and giggles. A risen church. You can quote me on that. The Hebrew word for day is actually a Hebrew word, yom, which is used all throughout the Hebrew scriptures and elsewhere in history to mean lots of things. It doesn't actually mean a 24-hour span of time. It actually gets translated in some places to mean age, as in like the ice age, right? It could be a day, or it could be 10 billion years. We don't really know. We'll find out. Actually, as we read into the scriptures, we'll get to. I'm not going to quote this when I said I was, Alex. But Psalm 94 actually says, "For God, 1,000 years is as a passing day, as brief as a few night hours." Well, that's extremely frustrating mathematically and scientifically. I mean, first of all, is it 1,000 years? Is 1,000 years like a day, or is it like a couple of hours? Right? First of all, okay, so I see that. For God, one day equals 1,000 years. So that means that a day of creation is like 1,000 years. No, it's not even in this verse. This is the Bible telling us, hey, God doesn't experience time the same way you experience time, and so don't read how into a why book. But again, so is this kind of making sense? We're seeing a poem. We're also seeing that in the Hebrew language, anytime we see the word day, we're seeing yom, which is used elsewhere to mean years, mean ages. We don't really have a scientific explanation here. There was a space between, then God said, let there be a space between the waters. Separate the waters from the heavens, from the waters of the earth. And that was what happened. I don't know exactly what any of that means. I don't know exactly what it's trying to lay out, but I think it's pretty, right? It's beautiful, and there are some helpful things that we could discover in this. But I want to skip through some and get down to verse 20. In verse 20, it says, this is the fifth day, the start of the fifth day, the fifth age, the fifth yom. God said, let the waters swarm with fish and other life. So what does God say? What does the Bible say are the first creatures, the first vertebrate creatures to actually be created? Let the waters swarm with fish and other life. And then it says, and the skies, let the skies be filled with birds of every kind. So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that scurries and swarms in the water, and every sort of bird, each producing offspring of the same kind. And God saw that it was good. Then he blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply. Let the fish fill the seas and the birds multiply on the earth. So what would it appear to be saying, even just if we're not talking about a scientific book, we're not talking about how necessarily, but just in the chronology of it, I believe that what we're seeing here is that the Bible teaches that first there were fish, 3,000 years before On the Origin of Species, 3,000, not to disprove any of that, just to say, hey, can faith and science be reconciled? Can biblical faith and science be reconciled? 3,000 years before this, the Bible says, fish first, and then there was some sort of scurrying things, other water aquatic creatures, and then birds, right? We're next. First you made fish, and then there were birds. And then if we were to read on to verse 24, it says, let the earth produce every sort of animal, each producing offspring of the same kind, livestock, small animals that scurry along the ground, and wild animals. And that's what happened. God made all sorts of wild animals, livestock. So he's sort of talking about mammals, animals that create after their own kind, right? A baby horse looks kind of like a little tiny horse, right? After its own, that's essentially what it's saying. They're mammals. And then, if we were to read on, we would discover that eventually God makes man. So, all of this to say, if this is crazy and you're just like, I'm checked out, Drew, no thanks on this message, no thanks. Obviously, you probably weren't the person that asked the question or part of the community of people who were interested in a response to the question. What I want us to do, though, what I wanted to provide you with was a tool to say how and why are different. Let's not confuse how and why. This book does not primarily concern itself with how when it comes to scientific things, and I don't think we should say that it does. This says who God is and why you are here. Now, with that being said, when we began to look at it as poetry, when we began to look at it as what it is, what we discover is that 3,000 years before anybody else really had this idea of like, you know what, I bet there were fish first, and then there were probably birds, and then there were mammals, and then there were humans. I bet it kind of looks that way. 3,000 years before that was ever published, the scriptures already said that. So even in their poetry, even in the reality that it doesn't explain how, what we discover is that this conflict that we think exists between the two. Now, did evolution happen? Did they actually, did a fish evolve into an amphibian and into a reptile and into a bird? Ask God when you get there, okay? I don't know. I don't know on that one. This is where I'm gonna play my theologian card and say, I'm not a scientist, I've not studied these things, but all I'm really concerned about is can the two be reconciled? And I really think they can, with a little bit of humility, as long as we don't let pride get in the way. And then secondly, understanding what the scriptures are. Is this helpful? Does this provide something at least to think about, at least something to talk about over lunch? If you did that, I'm becoming a geek about this stuff. I'll just tell you, I could stand up here and tell you everything that I've discovered, and I watched every TED Talk I could find. I read every scientifically I don't know what the right word is, unverified Google explanation of things that I could find. I tried to verify some of them, but I tried to learn everything I could about this because I found it so remarkable once I started thinking about, well, I wonder if they can be reconciled. I wonder, do I have to abandon reason to follow Jesus? Do I have to abandon science to follow Jesus? Do I need to fight the work of scientists? And I would say, I really see no reason for that. I think we need to be reconciled to this community of brilliant people who are primarily concerned with helping people like we are, primarily concerned with making humanity a better species, making the planet a better place. God reminds us through the prophet Isaiah 55:8, and then Megan, if you want to kind of be getting ready, I'm going to have you come up and answer some of the really tough ones. He explains to us in Isaiah 55:8, my thoughts are nothing like your thoughts, and my ways are far beyond anything you could imagine. God himself tells us through the prophet Isaiah, hey, you're not going to understand how I do this stuff. I didn't explain how, first of all, because you wouldn't really be able to comprehend it. At some point, you're gonna reach a limit on your ability to even understand this stuff. So all the questions that are raised about this, how does this actually work, Drew? Was it a literal 6 days that he created? I don't know. Could God have created all the world in 6 days? Sure. Did he? I don't know. I don't believe the scriptures actually teach necessarily that he did. His ways are beyond what I can imagine. Fair enough. Fortunately, nobody asked me how we got here. You only asked if the two could be reconciled, and I believe they can. I believe biblical faith and science really can work together with a little humility on our part and a true understanding of what the scriptures actually are. So here comes First Lady, Sister Pastor. Megan and I are sharing roles at the end of these messages. We're trying to respond to a couple of questions at once. Hey, whose table is it? All right, we'll share it. She's going to respond to a couple of questions, and I'm going to respond to one more. And if you texted any questions in, we'll get those now, and I'll at least bring it up. I'm not going to try to respond right now if there's nothing easy to respond to. You didn't have anything to say. Nobody texted us anything, so if you think of anything in the next couple of minutes, we'll we'll keep an eye on them. Megan, tell them what you got.
Right. First question. What is the importance of baptism? So baptism is basically an outward demonstration of and celebration of an inward commitment that you've already made to follow Jesus. And so we baptize because Jesus modeled it for us first, and we want to do everything we can to follow Jesus. In John 3:13, it says, "Then Jesus went from Galilee to the Jordan River to be baptized by John." We also baptize because Jesus told us to as part of the Great Commission. In Matthew 28:19, he says, "Therefore go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." And baptism served as one of the earliest symbols of trusting in the new covenant for your forgiveness of sins. Baptism began essentially to kind of replace some of the more violent, kind of bloody and difficult ways of seeking God's forgiveness in the first century. So that's kind of how it began. We don't believe that baptism completes your salvation. We don't believe that's something that you have to do in order to get into heaven. You're saved by trusting in God, trusting in Jesus for your salvation. In Luke 26:42 through 43, and you're probably familiar with this story about the thief on the cross. Jesus, he's telling this man that he will inherit eternal life because of his faith and his trust in him, and who Jesus says he is. And the man doesn't get a chance to get baptized right before he dies, but he's still assured that he will be in heaven. And so baptism is just an outward expression and public, just a way to make it public to everyone around you of what has already happened on the inside. And then we've also been asked whether baptism is the first step in the process of things like baptism or First Communion and other things like that. Those steps exist in other churches. They don't exist here. But if you feel like you are that specific order is right for you and your family, you're more than welcome to let them play out in your life and your family's life. But we don't necessarily see a scriptural command to do those things in a specific order.
Yeah. Good thought. I got a question here that's one of my favorite questions of all. Just so you know, I do have favorites that came in. Do you think God created life somewhere other than Earth? I'm so glad somebody asked this. I don't know if they meant it as a joke or not, but it's an interesting question, especially considering today's message. If we think about, today's message, is this a how book or is it a why book? A more traditional approach, maybe, or maybe an approach that you are more familiar with in the church to reading Scripture might say, might quote a couple of verses about angels and demons and other representatives of heaven. Maybe most notably, like when an angel comes from another realm and speaks to the Virgin Mary and says Jesus is coming, and say, yeah, maybe there is life somewhere else because there appear to be those, but that's not what they're asking, obviously, right? Nobody's asking, like, are there angels and demons in the Bible? You want to know if there are aliens. And so that question's interesting. Hopefully, after a message like today's, we can be a little more open to answer with something like, I don't know, right? The Bible doesn't seem to say that there are, but the Bible doesn't concern itself with explaining every single detail of the universe, right? So I don't think we're really responsible for saying there are no aliens anywhere because the Bible doesn't say that there are aliens anywhere. Well, it doesn't say that there aren't either, first of all. And second of all, I don't want to be the type of follower of Jesus whose faith can be disproved by something that happens, right? If we do find an alien somewhere, and then I got to come back and say, well, actually, the Bible never actually really said there weren't. It doesn't, right? So why do we commit ourselves to that? So the Bible doesn't concern itself with explaining every scientific detail of everything. And so, all right, is there life elsewhere? Maybe, right? The Bible doesn't tell us how an atom works. The Bible doesn't even tell us, how sex works. But we figured it out, right?
Oh, no.
That's not in the notes. But
Never doing with this again.
I didn't put it in the notes. I had that idea this week. Made that joke. But that's all I'm saying. Like, that's what, whenever we read the scriptures, it's important to understand this is not a how book at every level. It's who God is and why you're here. Is there life elsewhere? Who knows? The Bible doesn't concern itself with telling us every detail of everything. Megan, you want to answer something else?
Yes, moving on. So, nobody's going to remember anything from today. Except for that.
We have 2 kids, Megan.
Why do you use the pronoun he when referring to God? And is God a male? It's a good question. We use he because the scriptures use he. In anything that you read, Jesus refers to God as he in the Bible. And he tells us to refer to God as Father in, is it Matthew, what's the Lord's Prayer? Matthew 6. Yeah, in Matthew 6, he says to start to pray like this, and he starts the prayer with our Father who art in heaven. And I think everybody's a little bit familiar with that. With that being said, God is not male. God's not female. He's God, right? He is the being of God. And we don't use the word it because that makes God kind of impersonal. It kind of takes away from who he is in our lives and just kind of, it makes it more of like a force, I guess, an impersonal force of like gravity or, government or whatever it may be. So that's why, I suppose, why we don't use the word it. And we could solve the problem by never using a pronoun. But that would just be really awkward and annoying and hard, especially when you're reading if you never use the pronoun for that. And so it just brings us back to he. And then you have a little something else you want to say?
Yeah, maybe just another thought on that. And I think there's a question beneath this question that we may address in a little more detail next week at the end of next week's message. That kind of addresses something that a lot of people feel like the Bible is somewhat misogynistic in nature, that it has been certainly used to favor men over women, and I think that's problematic to what the scriptures actually teach. I don't think that's actually true, but that is part of what it is. It is certainly something that people have used the Bible to do, right? Let's make no mistake on that. People have certainly used this book, this collection of writings, to say men are better than women, men are stronger than women, men are even, most notably a majorly misquoted, misrepresented section of scripture that shows the Apostle Paul teaching that wives should submit to their husbands. Skips that the next verse, the previous verse said, all of you should submit to each other. And then he goes on to say wives should submit to their husbands, and husbands should submit to their wives, as though they were laying down, as even if it came to you laying down your life for that other person. And so even that, and the teachings in the New Testament of Paul that say that women shouldn't speak in church. Well, that was a specific, obviously we don't feel that is bearing on us. That was actually addressing, this is an interesting thing, just history of the scriptures for you. That was addressing a specific problem that Paul had with a group of women coming to his meetings and standing up and saying, here's what the scriptures say. The only problem was they were illiterate. Women in that society couldn't read. And so Paul just said, let's just make a rule that if you can't read, you can't talk in these meetings and can't talk about. So that's a misogynistic culture, but the scriptures themselves, when they're used for that stuff, is really, really ugly stuff and really terrible stuff. And I'm sorry for some of the things that the church has done on that, but we don't believe that. We believe that Jesus actually champions women. We believe that Jesus would have certainly looked like a feminist in the first century. Even the discovery of the empty tomb was by women. Like the most important, significant historical miracle of all of mankind was actually discovered by women coming to the tomb first. And then most notably Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, just to wrap up this, bring the whole thing full circle. God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. And you got to know, first of all, when this was written, Nobody believed for all of human history. Only until recently in some Western cultures are we starting to fight for gender equality. But thousands of years before that even happened, this was written that said, God himself, God's self, if you would prefer that I not use a pronoun at all there, God's self said, I made people in my image, men and women. Women bear my image, men bear my image. God has male attributes, God has female attributes. We call him he because the scriptures do and because we need a pronoun. But we don't believe he's male. We believe he made women in his image as well as men. So does that make sense? We are way over time. Thank you so much for being a part